Nuclear Revenge. Posted by you/ga at VDC. In good and bad times. Hi there. I have a small story to share. It's my grandmother that shared this with me and my wife last night. However, this is not really nuclear revenge or pro, but I didn't know in which subreddit to share this, as it involves quite some disturbing thought. Also, the usual, English is not my prime language and on my mobile phone. My grandmother is fairly wealthy. Thanks to family money and a few good investments, she built up her inheritance to what it is now. Due to never having to work and enjoying the finer things in life, a bottle of white wine a day keeps the doctor away. She had quite the circle of friends that are quite wealthy or successful themselves. It's like a cliché from a movie. This story involves one of her friends. I will call her friend Maria, and her husband will be named Joseph. Maria and Joseph were long time married. They started with a small furniture business. Maria was the salesperson and Joseph was responsible for buying the new collections. While Maria had to stay in the country and keep an eye on the shop and the kids, Joseph could venture through Europe in the search of new, cheap but nice furniture to flip with a huge profit. It all started fine. Kids were growing up and the shop got quite successful, eventually becoming one of the biggest ones in the country. This thanks to mutual effort of Maria and Joseph. However, dark clouds started to form in their marriage. Joseph wasn't only looking to score furniture, he also scored loads of women in other countries, leaving Maria alone for weeks while he scored a few couches and slept on some as well. This is the pre-digital era, so no mobile phones yet. Only the promise to send a letter once in a while. During their life together, Joseph would cheat on Maria every time he saw the chance. After a while he even didn't care anymore if Maria knew. Would even bring his mistresses to the home city to spoil them in fancy restaurants. Note, this was a different time. Women's rights are established now, but this wasn't always the case. When Maria decided that it was enough, the abuse began. Mentally as physically, he started to abuse her for a long period in their marriage. She couldn't leave him because of the kids, because of her lifestyle and because of the business, and he knew, so she endured, and every time she decided to fight back, painful consequences happened. He was the man, even having intercourse with her without her permission to establish his rights as the man. Later in their life, they are becoming elders, gave the shop to their kids and retired. Decided to take it easy. Maria long lost her interest already in Joseph but still couldn't leave him. When money is involved, people tend to endure a lot. And Joseph got sick, really sick. A combination of Parkinson and cancer. Eventually ending up in a wheelchair. Maria, like every good old wife, decided to nurse him till she couldn't do that anymore. In my country you have something like euthanasia. If you still have a good mind and you have a lot of pain, you can go to the doctors and the notary and draft a paper that whenever you cannot care for your own anymore, you can commit legal suicide, simplifying terms. Note, it's important to say that the spouse has to keep the official letters and make the final say, because the person involving it often doesn't have the correct mindset anymore. And thus, her revenge began. Joseph got worse. Joseph got in the hospital and his cancer started to infest his body. He was a shade of his former self. Having pain all day and morphine could only help so much. Even though he was in the hospital for weeks and weeks, even though he begged and begged to Maria to hand over the euthanasia papers, she simply smiled and said no. Which papers? The first week he got in the hospital, she burned the papers. 4 weeks to come, he begged to die. 4 weeks Maria was at his side and simply said no, maybe tomorrow. Slowly watching her husband fade away. Hearing his pain, his begging. She would always answer that this is what he deserved. For the exterior world, Maria was a caring wife and Joseph was simply too far gone to make sense. if he rattled about the papers to someone else. 4,5 weeks in the hospital and Joseph died. A not so nice death, painful, gruesome, exactly on the terms that Maria decided how he should die. I found this tale quite disturbing. Maria got her revenge on her husband, giving him hope that it could be his last day and the pain will end, but crushing it every day again as well, to let him suffer in a cancer-infested body and to die on her terms, slowfully. TLDLR, Nat. Thanks for reading. Posted by you/cowboy_corruption. You were never my dad. Back in the mid-90s my sister got knocked up by a guy. She was 17, he was 18. I despised the guy with pretty much every fiber of my being. My mom decided, however, that a baby should know their father, so she invited him to come live in our house without telling me. Took me a week to calm down enough so that when I eventually came back I didn't punch him when I walked in the door. John was a piece of shit, great artistic talent, but all he did all day was sit out in the garage and do prison tats for people, in addition to stealing mine and my deceased father's power tools and pawning them for a few bucks so he could get some cigarettes. I worked a full-time job and went to school, so I would be gone 12 to 14 hours a day, but it felt like I was pulling into the driveway of a frat house, with a dozen or so people drinking and partying in the garage until I had to leave in the morning. I slowly curtailed that shit by being a giant pain in the ass to all the guests by having their cars towed or their wheels inexplicably slashed. By the time my nephew was 2, I'd managed to put a stop to the 24-hour party zone, but people would still congregate on Saturdays. A few months later I'd had enough and threw John to the curb. My sister's friends all came forward to tell her about how he'd hit on all of them and probably slept with half of them, plus some other skanks he'd meet, all the while professing his devotion to my sister and their child. After I'd thrown him out, John disappeared for 8 years. No idea where, and I really didn't care. Then came a court summons for a custody hearing. John was suing for custody. However, in the 8 years since he'd disappeared, my sister had met a guy and they'd gotten married. My nephew was formally adopted by his stepdad and changed his legal name. The first hearing was dismissed because the allegations made as the basis for the custody hearing were investigated by CPS and decided as having no substance in fact. Nephew wasn't beaten, abused, or neglected. House wasn't a disaster and in danger of falling apart, nor was it a health threat. Every few months John would file another custody hearing request until it finally got a date. John made a number of allegations, all of which were disproven by documentation and fact. Finally, the judge decided he'd had enough and called my 10-year-old nephew up and asked him who he wanted to live with. I don't know him. He walked out of my life when I was 2. He's not my dad, is my dad, and he, John, will never be my dad. And I don't ever want to see him again. The judge ruled against John and dismissed his custody request with prejudice. When I looked at John, he was sobbing in his chair as his mother comforted him. I sneered at him and flipped him off as I walked out of the courtroom. As to why John was missing for 8 years? Apparently he'd been committed to a mental facility in Tennessee, and when he got out years later he went on SSI disability and then plotted various ways to hurt me, my sister, and my mom once he got out. He'd called CPS on us, made a number of anonymous complaints about drugs and guns, and even called the fire department a time or two. The custody hearing was meant to be the culminating event. But fortunately John was an idiot and we had enough money to hire a good attorney. A few years later John tried to mend some fences with my nephew and invited him to come down to where he lived and meet his relatives, including a half-brother my nephew didn't even know he had. My nephew also has a half-sister, but her mother deliberately excluded John from the birth certificate. This is in addition to the half-brother and sister he has from his mom and adoptive father. Needless to say, my nephew was not terribly impressed by his relatives. Now my nephew and brother-in-law are some serious rednecks, and they both love guns, hunting, camping out, and generally living the redneck lifestyle, but apparently John and his family took it to some serious extremes. There's a photo I saw one time on the internet with some guy sitting on a toilet on his front porch, and I imagine John and his extended family lived something like that, only seriously and not done as an internet joke. Considering the area, I would not be surprised. When my nephew was 15, almost 16, we received a call that John was dead. Someone had put a gun to the back of his head and blown his brains out as he sat on the couch in his mobile home. I felt sorry for John's girlfriend and her son, who found him, but for John the first didn't feel a thing. A journalist tracked my nephew down a few months later and filled us in on some details. Apparently John had been killed as the result of a murder-for-hire plot. We learned through our own sources that John had been dealing drugs and unknowingly moved into someone else's territory. The would-be drug kingpin paid a guy a few $100 and the promise of an ATV to kill John. Typical redneck retribution, I guess. The journalist asked my nephew for a quote. "Sure. I wish I could meet the man who killed him." "Why's that?" the journalist asked. "So I could shake his hand. John was never my dad, and I won't miss him."